righty. Okay. Hey guys, thanks very much for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here speaking to you guys. It's a really great group, and I'm super excited to talk to you guys. I'm Alex Newman. I'm a reporter for the New American Magazine, WorldNet Daily, other great publications. And I see we have the real media here. Just a minute ago I talked to InfoWars, and so it's great that the real media came out. Whether the fake media comes or not, who cares? But it is good that the real media is here. Anyways, I'm Alex Newman. Let me see if I can get my presentation up. And I actually got a degree in journalism from the University of Florida. I was miseducated there for 2 years, got my BS degree, and it is called a BS degree. And then I went straight to go look at what was going on with the climate stuff. So graduated in 2008, and then 2009 I was off to Copenhagen to chase the UN climate people around and see what they were up to. And boy, did I get a rude awakening. It was... You know, I kind of had an open mind at the start. You know, everybody talking about global warming, what's going on here. But if you know anything about journalism and you start doing your most basic research, you realize that we're dealing with a monumental fraud here. And you don't even really have to do a lot of research. I mean, it's plainly evident. Anybody with common sense should be able to see it. So I'm Alex. Educator, author, consultant, journalist, a bunch of other things. Holly Swanson, who spoke before, what a great presentation, and I agree with her. The solution to this is our kids. If we let the government schools brainwash them, we've already lost. We might as well all go home. There's nothing more to do. So we need to focus on the schools. I'll talk a little bit about the schools here in my presentation. I co-wrote a book with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld on education. We deal a little bit with all this and how they're dumbing down the children deliberately in the schools with environmental propaganda and other bad things. So we'll hit all of those things if we have time. So here, fake media, right? Back in 1975, this was actually Newsweek, April 28th, the fake media. They said that global cooling was going to get us all. And that's actually from the magazine. You can see right there. They warned that global cooling was coming to get us. And they weren't kidding. They spent a lot of time with this global cooling hoax. They went from the 60s to the early 80s pushing the global cooling narrative. This article that was in Newsweek, The Cooling World, said that man-made global cooling was going to cause famines and who knows what else. And here's a direct quote. Climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders are going to take action to compensate for the climate change. Where have we heard that before? Right? Fortunately, they didn't take any action because one of the solutions proposed in this article, and I kid you not, go pick it up yourself, we should melt the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot, right? Talk about fake news. What a crazy idea. Now they're stressing about the Arctic is going to disappear and blah, blah, blah. Back then they wanted to melt it. So they cited all the prestigious things, you know, National Academy of Sciences and NOAA and all the government bureaus and the universities. And it wasn't just Newsweek, it was all the fake media. You know, the Time, Life, National Geographic, they all had the global cooling hoax. And they were really serious. And here's one of the global cooling guys. One of the earlier speakers brought him in. He was one of the early global cooling nuts, John Holdren. He's Obama's science czar now. And you might be surprised to know that the solution to global cooling was actually the same as the solution they proposed for global warming. Global government, reducing the population, carbon taxes, all this kind of nutty stuff was the same solution they were pushing for global cooling back in the day. And one of the speakers mentioned the book Ecoscience. I encourage you to go to your library and pick up a copy of this. Don't buy it, but do pick up a copy and take a look at this. These guys, John Holdren, Obama's science czar, and Paul Ehrlich, and some of the others, they proposed creating a planetary regime, and that's their word, not mine, to control resources, to manage the population, and to do a whole bunch of other stuff. Some of the stuff they proposed was forced abortions for women, right? I guess they're big fans of communist China there. You violate the one-child, now the two-child policy, and so then you must, by force, be strapped down and have your children murdered. They also proposed sterilizing the population by adding sterilizing agents into the public water supply. So I bet you're enthusiastic about your public water coming into your tap now. But this is the guy that Obama thought should be his science czar. This is the guy who thought 1 billion people were going to die from global cooling. Now, of course, he's a global warming nut. He wanted eugenics, of course, right, and the planetary regime. And now he is, of course, as we all know, a global warming nut, right? And so we had record cold in 2013, record snow, and this defied all the global warming predictions. And so the media needed some talking points. What are we going to say? Everybody's buried in snow. It's freezing outside. We've never had temperatures like this. And so along comes Mr. Global Cooling, and he says that a growing body of evidence suggests that the kind of extreme cold being experienced by much of the United States is what we're going to see with increasing frequency as global warming continues. So, and so this was parroted in every big media outlet, right? They needed their talking points so they could say, oh, global warming's still real, you still need carbon taxes, and so John Holdren was happy to provide it. When he was confronted on this, they said, so what's this growing body of evidence that says global warming is going to cause record cold and record snow? He said, oh, well, that's my opinion. I don't have to comply with federal honesty laws and transparency laws. So unbelievable, this stuff. And if we had a real media, this would be common knowledge. I wouldn't need to be up here telling you guys this. Everybody would know already because we have a real media doing its job. Unfortunately, we don't. Speaking of fake news, remember first they wanted to melt the Arctic ice cap. Then in 2007, BBC, the British government's propaganda organ, their fake news outlet, said that the Arctic summers are going to be ice-free by 2013. Well, 2013 came and went, and guess what? The Arctic summers were not ice-free, not even close. The BBC said there was these modeling studies that indicate that they may be ice-free within 5 to 6 years. Some experts said it would happen even sooner than that, right? So you can imagine 2007 people said, oh, goodness, the Arctic ice is all going to melt. We better submit to global government and carbon taxes and regulations and so on. Some of them, this guy who worked with NASA and the Naval Postgraduate School, what's his name, Professor Maslowski, he said that 2013 might even be too conservative. Maybe the ice will all be gone before that, and not because we're going to cover it with black soot to melt it. And these guys still have jobs, believe it or not, and they're still quoted in the fake media talking about how we need to address global warming with carbon taxes. So in the real world, they couldn't have been more wrong, right? Europe's satellite said there was 9,000 cubic kilometers of ice at the end of the 2013 melt session. And that's up from 6,000 the year before. In 2007, you can see here the extent of post-summer melt was actually 4.28 million square kilometers. And by 2013, when we were supposed to have an ice-free summer up there, actually even on the lowest day of the whole year, it was greater than the 2007 low average by an area the size of California. So, did they apologize? No. Did they run a correction? No. Did they say, oops, we got it wrong, we're not going to quote these experts anymore? No. The same guys who said this are back in the media just literally in 2014 saying, oh, maybe we got it wrong. 2016 is when there's going to be no ice. And of course, there was still ice at the end of the melt season in 2016. But you wouldn't know it from reading the media, right? So the media is really out to lunch. Speaking of global warming, there's a lot of global warming. Some global warming scientists got stuck in their global warming. This was really funny. And if you follow the fake media, you know, the CNNs and the ABCs and the CBSs of the world, you probably don't know this story. If you follow the real media, you might have heard it. But some global cooling or some global warming alarmists, they went down to the southern hemisphere. They said, we're going to go study global warming, right? The ice is all disappearing. We need to go see what's going on. We're going to take persuasive footage to give it to the media. And actually, they had a whole bunch of fake journalists on board from the BBC and the ABC and all this. And surprised, they didn't tell you what was really happening. But they named the trip after Sir Douglas Mawson. He had gone down there 100 years before. And actually, he didn't get stuck in the ice, even with the technology that was 100 years old. So what happened was there was record ice, and ironically they went down to study the disappearing ice, and obviously they needed a lot of CO2 and fossil fuels to get out of this ice. So it was really poetic justice. You know, you got to think God's got a sense of humor, right? It's just amazing how this works. But you really didn't hear this story from the media, right? The media that did report this story said, oh, it was a tourist ship. No, it wasn't a tourist ship. It was a global warming ship led by a global warming professor to study global warming. But of course, the media didn't tell you that. So, I could have done this all day, right? Because I'm limited on time, I had to really restrain myself. But I wrote an article on this, so I just used this. But in May of 2014, you guys might have seen the fake media headlines. Here's a sample of them. The LA Times, the irreversible collapse of the Antarctic has begun. And, you know, you can go down the list. The Christian Science Monitor, catastrophic collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet now underway. New York Times, scientists warn of rising oceans. Boston Globe, Antarctic ice sheet rapidly collapsing. And what are the facts? Well, basically the opposite of what they said. Surprise. So even the study that they referenced, the study that justified these absurd headlines, said maybe in hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, this ice, this one little teeny tiny glacier might go into the sea. But from reading the headlines in the fake media, you'd be justified to think we might be underwater tomorrow. Obviously, that's not going to happen. The two glaciers that we're talking about make up less than 1% of the Antarctic ice. And even according to NASA, and I don't consider NASA a trustworthy source at this point anymore. I've interviewed Gavin Schmidt, and man, is he out to lunch on everything. But Even according to NASA, Antarctica is gaining massive amounts of ice, trillions and trillions of cubic kilometers of ice. It's massive snowfall. Sea ice was at record levels in recent years, and we're not in any danger of sinking under the sea, despite what the media might say. And so where does all this craziness come from? How can it be that the media has gotten it so incredibly wrong? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One of them is that the media is really the fake media. I should just differentiate between the real media, the alternative media, and the establishment media, the establishment's propaganda organs. But the establishment's propaganda organs, first of all, are controlled by a very tiny group of corporations. They have interlocking boards. They're all tied to the mega banks. They're all corporate members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They all get their marching orders from the same place. So that's the big problem to start with. And then, of course, the UN encourages this, right? In May of 2015, they put out a whole bunch of press releases, and I get the UN press releases. It's really fun. I encourage you to sign up. But they announced that their media partners were going to launch this huge information campaign. They said it was going to be the world's largest advertising campaign. They were going to train so-called journalists, and they were going to subsidize so-called journalists to report favorably on their crazy agenda. And they did. They spent lots and lots of money on this stuff. The UN Communications Group brought together all the heads of all the agencies so they could coordinate their propaganda, and they were going to tell the world the UN story and the global warming story and why we need to give the UN more power and more money and global carbon taxes and all of the rest of this stuff. So no surprise, the Billionaires Club is involved. This is not my term. Actually, this is a term from a Senate report. The Senate Environmental Committee put out a report in 2014, and this is something I again, really encourage you to take a look at, because this is straight from the horse's mouth. The Senate did this investigation, and they said there's a Billionaires Club. They mentioned people like a Rockefeller and Bill Gates and these, who are pushing this green movement and pushing the climate hoax, and they are using the media in conjunction with their fake studies and their propaganda apparatus to push this and to disseminate it to the American people and to the whole world. And actually this Senate report suggested there may be crimes taking place here, because a lot of these guys have conflicts of interest. They're profiting on one side and scaring us about global warming on the other. So, this is something that really ought to be investigated more thoroughly, probably by a law enforcement agency. So we have a lot of Orwellian language, and this is true all across the media, right? I know you guys are very familiar with all this, but they use doublespeak. They call the UN's peacekeeping forces. They're peacekeeping forces when they're really war-making forces, right? And so the same thing applies to the global warming hoax. They constantly call people who refute and expose their theory as incorrect. They call us deniers, right? And that's supposed to be a reference to Holocaust deniers, people who say the Holocaust didn't happen. So they're trying to equate people who discredit their silly theory with people who question the Holocaust, which, a lot of people in their mind think that's very evil and so on. So this is really Orwellian language. If you point out the facts of this debate, it has nothing to do with the Holocaust, and yet they do this all the time. And all the establishment media publications and all the politicians at this point, from Obama to the UN, all over the world, they call the CO2 pollution. They call it carbon pollution, and we've had some really excellent scientists here talk about whether CO2 is pollution. Obviously it's not, right? Real scientists refer to this as the gas of life, and yet here we have them demonizing it as pollution. So here's one image, and I've got a few more on the next slide. We have consensus science too, right? As if consensus were how science is done. But here's some more of the propaganda, and we'll get to more on CO2 in just a minute. But you see these pictures here. The one on the left is from the UK Guardian, and it's on a global warming story. The worst ever carbon emissions leave climate on the brink. And then we have on the right, Time magazine, how to keep companies honest about fighting climate change. Now, do you suppose that's CO2 coming out of those smokestacks? No, of course not, right? CO2 is an invisible gas. But, 99% of the people who read these far-left news outlets, the fake media, probably don't know that. So they think, oh, wow, that's scary. Look, the sun is covered by the pollution, the carbon pollution. We're all going to die. And this is all fake, right? This is an invisible gas. It's necessary to life on Earth. We exhale it when we breathe. And they're here telling us that this is pollution, that we need to pay a tax on. And this is the media, right? These are supposed to be the ones holding the powerful accountable and all this kind of stuff. What is wrong with these people? So some of the other presenters talked about CO2. Again, this wonderful, beneficial, amazing gas. We wouldn't exist without CO2. Life on this planet would not exist. It's required by plants. It's exhaled by people. It's in your Coca-Cola every time you drink your soda. And Earth is currently starving for more CO2, right? One of the scientists up here put up some of the numbers. All of the vegetation grows better with more CO2. These plants were designed to operate with more CO2. And yet we're being told this is a pollution that's going to kill us all. So they say the CO2 drives global warming, even though human emissions of carbon dioxide represent less than 1% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Water vapor, obviously, is the most prominent, 95% more or less. And, this is crazy. The media never tells you any of this, but if you knew these facts, everything else that the media is saying would just sound absurd. We would laugh at these people, and we should. But from a totalitarian perspective, making CO2 carbon pollution is absolutely genius because we exhale CO2. There's nothing we can do that doesn't produce CO2. So if you're a tyrant and you want to control everything people can do, there is no better vehicle to do it than demonizing CO2 as pollution. So we have the fake consensus, right? They keep telling us that the consensus is done, the science is settled, and we have to just give up. 97% of scientists agree with global warming is what the media tells us on a constant basis. If you follow the fake media, you've heard this 1,000 times. 97% of people agree with global warming, or scientists. And, one of the other presenters talked about this. Nothing could be further from the truth. Even according to the guy's own definition, they looked up 12,000 papers to do this study. Only 65 of them, less than 1% of the scientific papers involved in this actually endorsed the man-made global warming alarmism. Now, that's not 97% of scientists agree with global warming. Sorry, the media is wrong, the media is lying. And, this is basic journalism 101. You go back and you check and you see what's going on here. Obviously, something is wrong here, right? And all the big skeptic studies were actually excluded from this study. So Jo Nova from Australia figured that out. She went and looked at all the skeptic studies she knew of, and she said, whoa, they left them all out of the study. How could they possibly make these claims without looking at the studies? But they didn't. So, the global warming activist is totally discredited, but you still see this 97% figure touted all the time. Even this week, there's lots of news stories out there saying that 97% of scientists agree with global warming. Now, real journalists would be able to look at this. I've been to a whole bunch of these UN conferences. They come up with their climate models. And here's the average. One of the scientists showed this too. The red line there is the average of the UN's models that they use in their IPCC report. And they said that's what's going to happen as CO2 emissions increase. Every single one of those models predicted more warming. Now, you could literally put a monkey in a cage, give him some dice, and say, hey, monkey, roll these dice. The monkey would have a much, much better track record than the UN's computers, the supercomputers and the climate models. And yet, this is the propaganda we're fed all the time. As a journalism student, if I was a journalism professor, I would flunk any student who took these models seriously. This is total craziness. You have an obligation as a journalist not to allow your readers to be misled, whether it's by a politician or an oil company or anybody else. So the first thing you do is say, well, what does the track record look like here? Well, there's their track record, right? The green and the blue lines are the actual observable evidence, right? Those come from the satellites and from the weather balloons. So this is super basic stuff. Anybody can look this up. This isn't some kind of secret. And if you look through the UN's reports, you'll find a lot of this too. And yet, we don't see it in the media. And so now they have excuses, right? The Ocean ate my global warming. It was Obama's favorite one. Came out in leaked documents. That's what they were pushing the UN to say for why we haven't had global warming in almost 20 years and counting. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of my experiences at these UN summits. Right? I was accredited as a journalist, and I'll tell you, I never felt so out of place in my life. I'm sitting there with other supposed journalists, and I've never felt so out of place. I call these the cheerleading sections because that is the role that they play at these things. And it sounds strange unless you've been there. It's a surreal experience. You go into the journalism thing. These are climate activists. When the politicians and the communist Chinese come out and they say, we have a deal, we have an announcement to make. The journalists stand up and they do a standing ovation. They say, yay, hooray. This is not the role of journalists. And, occasionally you'll get one or two who's uncomfortable with this, and even if they believe the global warming theory, they're like, yeah, okay, I'm just going to sit down. But you have a room full of cheerleaders pretending to be journalists. At the most recent one I went to in Paris last year in December. Some of the people in this room were also there. That was fun. There was a wonderful gathering of scientists just down the road from this UN climate conference. Some of the most amazing scientists from around the world, the professors at great universities and really some of the top experts. They had a meeting. How many journalists do you suppose came? 3. There was me and 2 others. And the 2 others were there to do gotcha questions and ambush questions. And, That's what passes for. There was thousands of journalists in Paris from all over the world to cover this UN summit, and none of them, except these two who wanted to do gotcha questions, were actually interested in what the scientists had to say about the science. So something is very wrong here. When you went to the actual UN conference center, they had a big plasterboard, and you could see a whole bunch of the media organizations were sponsoring the UN summit. I am not kidding. So what is going on here? What is going on here? At the Rio Plus 20 Sustainability Summit down in Rio de Janeiro, I went down there too. Lots of talk of global warming, and this is where journalists again burst into applause when they announced that they had this totalitarian deal. And they always omit the really important news, right? So in Copenhagen in 2009, the Communist Chinese delegation stood up and they said, oh yeah, we did really good for the climate. We have prevented 400 million human beings from existing thanks to our barbaric one-child policy. And they did the math, they said that means we've emitted this much less carbon dioxide. And that should have been the top story around the world, right? Crazy lunatic Communist Chinese think that they're saving the world by killing babies. But no, right? No, nothing, silence. So unbelievable what's going on here. In Paris, we actually, my colleague and I were followed around by a communist Chinese agent. We went over to go ask some questions, gave him our business card. 5 minutes later, back in the cheerleading section, turn around, and there's the same guy taking pictures of us with his iPhone. So that was a weird story. But, there's no real journalists there. So when these people get a real question, they're like, oh, what's going on here? They're just not used to getting a real question because, again, the cheerleaders don't ask real questions. They say things like, oh, why aren't you saving us faster from global warming? What are we going to do to stop global warming? No real questions about anything. It's pathetic. And once you've gone through journalism school, I went to the University of Florida. It's supposed to be one of the best journalism colleges in the country. You understand why you have these pathetic journalists, so-called, parroting this propaganda. I mean, they really teach you that if the government says it, you can report it with confidence because even if it's wrong, well, at least it's the government's fault and not yours. Sorry, but that is not the attitude that we should be inculcating in our journalists. And it's a lot of this stuff is not a secret. The journalists who go to these conferences, they see all the same stuff that I see. Here's a poster. You see the sun and you see the sick earth, right? He's got the thermometer and he's not feeling good. And the sun comes along and says, I know your problem. You have humans, right? So you guys are all a disease. And that includes the cheerleading section. They're all a disease in the view of these sustainability fanatics. And yet, this is not on the front page of the newspaper, right? UN considers humans a disease. That'd make a good headline, right? That would get people to buy the newspaper. Why isn't that in the newspaper? Well, the summit was chaired by an anti-American Chinese communist who just a few years earlier had been giving a medal to the butcher of the Tiananmen Square protesters. Why wasn't that on the front page of the news? Why isn't the real news in the newspapers? Why isn't it on the TV? Well, we need to ask questions. Because the real agenda here is actually not saving the world from global warming. The real agenda is imposing tyranny on us. Here's the picture, system change, not climate change, right? And that's what they're after. By system, they mean, capitalism, freedom, national sovereignty, all that. And so they want to crush national sovereignty and empower this global governance stuff. So some of the other speakers brought up the Club of Rome. It's amazing what these guys say. So again, none of this information is secret. All the journalists would have to do is go to their favorite search engine and type in a few keywords, and all this information would be at their fingertips. So here's from the Club of Rome. They say the real enemy is humanity itself. Right, so this is the pervading attitude at these UN summits in this whole global warming narrative. Humans are the enemy. Humans need to be controlled. Humans need to be eliminated. Why isn't that in the newspaper? Well, because people wouldn't accept it, right? Nobody wants to be eliminated. Nobody wants their kids eliminated. They brag about these things at the UN summits, right? Here is the head, or former head, she just stepped down, of the UNFCCC, that's the chief UN climate bureaucracy. What's occurring here in the whole climate change process is the complete transformation of the economic structure of the world. So that's crystal clear. Every member of the cheerleading section heard these same comments if they were paying attention and not out partying or whatever. And why wasn't this on the front page of the newspaper? Sorry guys, we were wrong. This isn't about climate change. This is about the complete transformation of the world, right? You would think that would be news. Here they're talking about carbon budgets, right? All the carbon that we can safely burn, we have to let the third world dictators be in charge of it, and the rest of you evil first world countries, Europe, America, Canada, Japan, you guys need to stop. Here is Ottmar Edenhofer, co-chair of the IPCC working group. He says that we just got to get over this idea that this has anything to do with the environment, right? This is to do with wealth redistribution. And they tell us this, right? And one of the really interesting things that I've encountered. When I got out of university in 2008, I started calling up these climate scientists. Look up the people who serve on the IPCC. I've actually interviewed some of the scientists here, and it was a great pleasure, even some 5-6 years ago. And when you talk to these people, even a lot of the ones who've served on the IPCC, they'll tell you the truth. Hey, this whole thing is a fraud. They come up with the conclusions, and then they expect us to fit the data to fit their conclusions. And if you go back and you read the articles I've done over the years, you'll see I've quoted at least a dozen former members of the IPCC. Many of them have resigned in disgust. They said, hey, this is not science. I'm not participating in this fraud. But these guys are the experts in their field. They were selected by the UN to serve on these things. And when they find out that it's all a hoax, that it's all a fraud, they step down. This should be international news, and yet it's not, because we have an establishment propaganda machine, not a real media. So, of course, the real agenda is also taking away our liberty, right? You had Figueres, the same one who said that the fundamental transformation of the economic world. She said China is doing it right on global warming, right? The American system with the political hurdles, she complained, it's too hard to implement climate policy. So what is China doing, right? Killing babies, enslaving people, et cetera, et cetera. So it tells you a lot about what these kinds of people think. In this picture here, you might not recognize these guys. Maybe you see Stalin up in the top right corner. But the guy who's blabbering, that is Lysenko. So maybe that name doesn't mean a lot to a lot of you guys, but he was a pseudoscientist, and he had some really quack ideas on genetics, and Stalin decided that he liked those ideas, right? He thought that traits could be transmitted environmentally and so on, rather than being in the genes. And so a lot of people died as a result of this quackery. Stalin said, hey, this is going to be official science. Anybody who disagrees is going to a gulag, is going to be re-educated, is going to be killed or tortured. And eventually that imploded too, even in the Soviet Union. So there's still hope that the truth will eventually come out on top. The truth doesn't need a lot of money to support it. And I'm really encouraged, frankly. Now, I know there's been a lot of bad news here. We're all a little bit upset about how fake the media is, but there's good news, right? Here's just a handful, sampling of the good news. According to the Pew Research Center, this was a survey released, I think, at the end of 2014, only 40% of Americans actually believe the man-made global warming theory. Right? You won't hear that in the news either, because the numbers don't match what they want you to think. But this means that 60% of people don't. So all these years of propaganda, all the stuff going on in the government schools, all the propaganda from the establishment media, and that's the best they can do, 40% of the public. And you break that down further. You say, okay, 40% of people believe this theory. What percent of those think we need to sell ourselves into slavery and regulate and tax the gas of life at the international level? Well, the percent will be even smaller, right? And we keep going down. So really what we're dealing with here is the fringe of the fringe of the fringe, pretending to be, the mainstream position. So we're all deniers and heretics and fringe, and these guys are pretending to be the mainstream when their own numbers show that they're out on the fringe of the fringe. This trend has accelerated, actually, the recent election. And Donald Trump, love him or hate him, he ran on a platform of global warming is a hoax, invented by the Chinese. It's BS, right? I won't repeat the words, but he called it that on Twitter. He said we're going to cancel the Paris Agreement. So he ran on a platform of climate denial, right? He's a denier, as the media would call him, and he won. So the media is losing its power, and that is a really, really encouraging thing. And if you look at the surveys, people everywhere are waking up. The AP did a survey, and this was before the election. They said 6% of the American people have a lot of trust in the national media. Another recent survey came out, Gallup, in mid-September. Only 14% of Republicans have trust in the mainstream media. And mainstream is not even a proper term to use here anymore. We're not dealing with mainstream. These people are the fringe of the fringe. They're so out of touch with mainstream America, we should stop calling them mainstream media. They're not mainstream. They represent a radical ideology way out of touch with what regular rank-and-file Americans believe. And so we should stop giving them legitimacy by calling them they like to call themselves the mainstream media. They're not mainstream. Or the establishment media or the hoax media. Maybe we can call them the fake news, right? Because fake news is in the news a lot now, right? So the media is still lying, right? They didn't learn their lesson from the latest election. They were already saying, oh, the Republican Party is going to die, right? It's dead, thanks to Donald Trump. And of course, Trump won. House is in Republican hands, Senate is in Republican hands, more legislatures than ever are in Republican hands. So the Republican Party didn't die. The media was wrong again. All their polls were wrong, and yet they're continuing with their lies. Just very recently, just in the last week or two, they said that Trump had done a U-turn and a flip-flop, and he had reversed himself on global warming, and they based this on a talk he had given to the New York Times. And in reality, he did soften his position a little bit. He wasn't as hardcore. He didn't say it was a hoax and we need to cancel the Paris Agreement. But he never said that he believed in man-made global warming theory. In fact, he said there's a lot of people, a lot of good scientists who disagree with your theory. And we're going to take a close look at all this. He said the emails, the climate emails where we caught these climate scientists conspiring to hide the data and hide the decline in global temperatures. So, this is what Trump was talking about. But the media didn't talk about any of that. They said he had flip-flopped and betrayed his supporters. So don't believe anything the media says. Whether Trump's going to do everything he said or not, I don't know. But don't believe the media. The media is lying constantly. They also claim that this Paris Agreement that was negotiated in Paris last year by Obama and the Dictators Club, the United Nations, was binding and we're not going to be able to get out of it. It takes 3 years, right? And nothing could be further from the truth. This is not a treaty. The U.S. Senate never ratified this thing. This is an executive agreement which doesn't exist, right? Find me in the Constitution where it authorizes an executive agreement. It's ridiculous, right? So we don't need to wait 4 years. We don't need to ask permission from China. We can drop it immediately. So they know that their fake news is no longer persuasive, right? That's why you're hearing fake news a lot. All the talking heads, Obama's running around talking about fake news, right? And by fake news, they don't mean the people who said that the Arctic ice was going to be gone in 2013. They don't mean the people who said that global cooling was going to kill us all unless we melted the Arctic ice cap with soot. That's not who they're talking about. They're talking about people who expose these frauds as frauds. So we're going to be hearing a lot more about this. You're going to have Google and Facebook trying to shut all this down. But my hope, and I'm optimistic here, is that they are going to further discredit themselves. But they still have a secret weapon in their arsenal, and that is the so-called education system. I don't think we should give them that much credibility. They're not an education system, right? They're the opposite of an education system. It is complete fraud. This is literally the opposite of education. I mean, if you guys take a look at the book that I have in the back that I wrote with Dr. Blumenfeld, he studied this for 50 years. This is not a national accident, right? The government system of education was engineered specifically to dumb down the population. And I realize that sounds rather out there. But when you look at the evidence, when you read the stuff that the people who designed the system wrote, it is doing the opposite of educating our children. It is miseducating and uneducating and preventing them from educating themselves. So that is a really big problem. At the state, at the federal, at the local, and at the international level now, they're all pushing this crazy pseudo-education, and the environmentalism is a huge component of it. The climate change agenda underlines so much of what they're planning to do in the years ahead. So it's crucial, I think, that we expose it. Here's just a small sample for you from the people who brought you Common Core. They don't call these Common Core, but it's literally the same organization, same method. It's called the Next Generation Science Standards. So this is the Common Core of science. And this is a quote directly from there, from the elementary section. Human activities, such as the release of greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels, are the major factors in the current rise in the Earth's temperature. So this is a national program. 26 states have already agreed to adopt this craziness. Most of the rest are still teaching this stuff, even if they don't specifically adopt the next generation science standards. So we have a big problem. And this is not only in the United States, actually. This is a worldwide thing. Holly touched a little bit on this, and I want to talk a little bit more about it. UNESCO is really the vehicle for this, and this is true even in our own country. UNESCO is a totally radical UN bureaucracy. It's the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It was so radical, Reagan withdrew. He said, wait a minute, this is a haven for dictators and tyrants and communists and Islamists. We don't need anything to do with that, so he withdrew, and then Bush rejoined, unfortunately. But they've been pretty transparent about their agenda all along. They want political unification in some sort of world government. They put out some pamphlets in 1949. This is a long time ago. and they said schools need to be used to combat family attitudes. And you can be sure that includes global warming stuff. And now they have all kinds of global programs. They have education for sustainable development that Holly touched on. They have education for world citizenship, and all these are related. And Bill Gates is, of course, a big financier of this. Bill Gates is obviously the main money man behind Common Core, and he is a big proponent of what's happening at UNESCO also. In 2004, 2005, he personally signed an agreement with UNESCO on global training programs for teachers all over the world. And they have programs for everything. You know, they want to start teaching sex education to 4-year-olds. I kid you not, I won't even say what they want to teach to 4-year-olds because it's not appropriate for any audience, much less kindergartners. They have training manuals on anything you can imagine, including reading, where they promote methods that have been debunked as quackery since the 1840s. They know that this will produce mass illiteracy. And so, of course, UNESCO is pushing it at the global level. They also have a World Core curriculum. If you really want to go down the rabbit hole, check this out. They want this in every school all over the world. The Core is supposed to teach children to see themselves as part of the greater whole. And actually, these standards were dedicated to Alice Bailey. So really, if you want to take a trip down the rabbit hole, look up Alice Bailey. One little teaser, she was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. She's a really weird lady. The current head of UNESCO is this lady right here, Irina Bokova. I spent a long time exposing her, and I'm glad I did. Actually, they were trying to put her as the UN Secretary General, and she gave a speech, and she had a lot of interesting things to say about education as it relates to climate change. She's an actual communist. She comes from the Bulgarian Communist Party. They've since renamed themselves to the Bulgarian Socialist Party. Her father was a leading member of the Politburo and the editor-in-chief of the Bulgarian Communist Party's main propaganda organ. He was actually a murderer as well. For some perspective, this Communist Party of Bulgaria murdered, according to statistics in Democide from the University of Hawaii's Rummel, 222,000 people, and this is a country of 7 million. So these are really dangerous people, right? And so, of course, they put her in charge of UNESCO. But she had a lot of comments about how education needs to be used to push the global warming hoax. She says UNESCO is working to reorient existing education programs, and not just in quote-unquote science, but in mathematics and in social studies, in the humanities, to educate the younger generation about climate change. And you'll see our illustrious Secretary of Education has said the same thing. And he said that UNESCO is his global partner. So we'll get to him in just a minute. Here's some more from that same speech. And, you know, I could spend years going through all the stuff UNESCO has produced. If you put UNESCO climate change education into your favorite search engine, you won't have time in your lifetime to go through all the propaganda that they've put out for the schools. But, you know, these are just a few quotes to whet your appetite, to give you a sample of what's going on at UNESCO. They say that responding to climate change starts with changes in our attitudes and in our behaviors. Last year, they put out a document on global education. They said that the UN and the UNESCO program needs to lead your children in spiritual values formation too. So they're coming out in the open now. They're dropping the mask. They're telling you what the agenda is. Article 6 of the UN framework on climate change deals with how to raise awareness about global warming through education and the media. Agenda 21 also has a whole section on education. And they say, Bokova says that climate change education lies at the heart of the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, which UNESCO, of course, leads. And they say that the overall aim, and look at this, I mean, this is straight from her speech. You can pull up this speech on UNESCO's website. This will provide the basis to reshape the social, cultural, and economic context of our development. So there's no area of your life, no area of your children's lives that's going to be untainted by this crazy agenda that they are pushing. Here's our former education secretary. He spent 7 years serving the Obama administration as the head of the U.S. Department of Education. And here you can go on the U.S. Department of Education's website and read his speeches. He says this all out in the open, which you know, leads me to believe that they are getting very cocky. You know, they think that they're getting close to achieving their agenda, and they don't care who knows it at this point. And they know, of course, that the establishment media will not tell the truth. But he says in his speech, he was actually talking to UNESCO. He said UNESCO is a global partner in education reform, cradle-to-career education reform. He brags that the Department of Education is working to create green and global citizens. He says that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I won't tell you who said that, but I will tell you that it was a communist terrorist. And he says, our goal for the coming year is to work closely with our global partners, including UNESCO. And he says the U.S. Department of Education is taking a leadership role on educating the next generation of green citizens. So what do they mean by green citizens? We've talked a little bit about this in some of the earlier presentations, right? They mean totalitarian citizens. They mean, I call them watermelons. We'll get to that. But we have, here's straight from the UN, again, from their UN Education for Sustainable Development. They say that more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people. And so in this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. So there you go. Do you think they want to give your kids a good education at school? They most definitely do not. And that's straight from the UN's website. You can read it yourself. Now they have the UN Agenda 2030. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he says this is the global declaration of interdependence, and he says this repeatedly, so it wasn't just a slip of the tongue. He also says the UN is the parliament of humanity. So, Robert Mugabe, he'll send his delegate to go sit there, the genocidal Marxist dictator of Zimbabwe, the North Korean maniac, he can send his representative to the parliament of humanity, and then we can just all get along, right? Won't that be nice? But in this Agenda 2030, they come out and tell you what they're doing vis-a-vis education. They say no one should be left behind, right? And they're not kidding. They mean no one. And they say that children and young women and men are critical agents of change. This is straight from the document. You can read it yourself. And they're going to find in these new goals a platform to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of what the UN thinks is a better world. And then they say, this is from the goal number 4, which deals with education. By 2030, they want to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills necessary, not just to submit to sustainable development or accept sustainable development, but to promote it. So they have an ambitious agenda, right? They want to brainwash your children so thoroughly that they won't just not say anything when they try to impose this on us. They will promote it. They will happily go along with it. And this is the exact kind of rhetoric that we've seen from all the dictators of the last century. These people have murdered hundreds of millions of people, and this is how they all talk, that you got to use the schools to brainwash and indoctrinate the children. And so, as far as solutions go, I say we really need to educate ourselves, right? We don't need to be scientists to realize that everything these people have predicted has been wrong, to realize that all of their climate models predicted warming and we've had none for 20 years, to realize that we didn't have global cooling and we shouldn't have melted the ice cap. We don't need to be experts and PhDs to understand this, to understand that the gas we exhale is not pollution in need of global government regulation. We don't need that kind of stuff. So we need to educate ourselves so we can talk intelligently to other people. We need to educate our families and our communities and our children, most importantly. We need to protect our kids from these people. If that means homeschooling, putting them in a Christian school, do something, but protect them from this lunacy, and then we need to pray. And that's all I have, guys. Thank you, and God bless America.